My high school history teacher was Mr. Newbaum, and one of my favorite teachers that I've ever had. And there are many reasons why I really liked Mr. Newbaum. And this wasn't necessarily the reason why I liked him, but one of the unique things about him is on his tests, this was a history teacher, the test, it'd be multiple choice, A, B, C, D. Every year he'd switch the letter, but throughout the course of the entire year, one of the options would always be a wrong answer. And so he would start with A. So the first year, A would always be wrong. And so you're going through this test, and you know that A is incorrect. That even if I think it might be A, I know it's wrong. And if you paid attention to the test, you could easily tell which one it was. Because sometimes he'd make pop culture references to, in its history, and he'd do other random things that would make you know, okay, this isn't the answer. And so all the A's aren't going to be an answer. He'd also put it in the instructions. And so there was no excuse for you to miss this. And so it was an easy way for us to increase our odds at getting the right answer. Now, he never chose D as the one that couldn't be right, because then you can't do all the above. So other than that, that was the only real nuance about it. But throughout the course of the whole year, both semesters, it would be the same letter that was not correct. And as I was thinking about that, I think sometimes we can get into life when we say, well, this is easy, or this is something that I don't have a problem with, and that we can be successful. But if we dig down a little deeper, we have to make sure we recognize that this is a bigger issue. And so Commandment 6 is one of those. Commandment 6 is you must not murder. And I think everybody's like, check. But it's deeper than this. Because remember, we're moving from the stone tablets, that this law that's written in stone, to the transforming work of Jesus on our hearts. With Ezekiel 36, if God will take from us our stony, stubborn heart and give us a tender, responsive heart. He will write His law on our hearts. He will put His Spirit in us to move us to follow His decrees and be able to obey His regulations. That's what we are moving towards. And so if this was a law that nobody had to work at, if this was an expectation that was so easy that it didn't even need to be written down, God wouldn't have wasted space on the tablets. He wouldn't have written this law on the Ten Commandments for Moses. And so when we get to this commandment, the murder, remember we connected to Jesus, and Jesus adds deeper meaning, a more holistic meaning, a heart matter that is at play. Now the law distinguishes between what is good and bad. And whenever we're talking about something like the law, we have to remember that we are the problem. Whenever there's insufficiencies or whether there's difficulties that we can't seem to overcome, the issue is not in the law that God has given, it's in us. It's because we are living in a sinful, fallen world that's destroyed because of sin, and we're living in that world and we're trying to overcome it, but we can't on our own. So sin seeks to distort that which is good and makes it bad. But remember, last week I talked about this concept called the rule of categories. And so the commandment of you must not murder, everyone says, okay, we don't do that. I've never met anybody who said, I don't think this should be in there. Right? Everybody agrees with it. Whether you are religious or not, murder is not something people think is a good idea. And so we come to the rule of categories, and it's deeper than just a physically taking the life of somebody. It extends to even things like physical violence, but also can extend to neglecting personal health, even things like reckless driving. Now, I'm not talking about road rage. Sometimes we get the heat of the moment and we honk our horn or get angry, and while those things aren't good, but this concept of murder, what it does is it forbids things that threaten or harm us or others. Now remember, most people, they start really small. Most individuals don't jump right away to grand larceny. They start with petty theft. They start with these little compromises that aren't good or aren't wise or really are destructive. And so they build from there. That's our tendency as people. We start small and we build. But when we think about something like murder, there is a concept that we have to come to terms with of, are we implementing justice or are we just killing? And part of what I'm getting at is there's a goal of punishment that as followers of Jesus, we recognize God does not chastise us just to make us feel bad. When God brings punishment, it's not just to make individuals feel bad. So as followers of Jesus, we implement this into our lives, and we recognize that as Christians, punishment is for the sake of society and for the sake of the offender. It's for both. Punishment has to include both, because punishment needs to be remedial. It needs to be redemptive, and it needs to be restorative. Now, we can get to certain situations where we need to create healthy boundaries and say, you've done this so many times, we're not going to subject ourselves to this, whatever that may be. And I'm talking about what we as followers of Jesus do. I'm not talking about what the government needs to do. And that can be a different conversation. That's not always the same. Now, we recognize prevention is always better than the cure. I would rather avoid getting a cold than to recover from the cold. Right? I mean, we recognize that, and oftentimes what happens is we tend to treat the symptoms, not the disease. But in order to actually get rid of it, we have to treat the disease, because sometimes these things happen. Now, if we can prevent it, awesome. But if we can't, and it does happen, then we need to say, how can we treat the disease? How can we get to the underlying root of it? Because when we talk about murder, the issue is your heart, not their heart. It's not the other person's heart. It's your heart. So as we think about what God is speaking to us, we always have to make sure we recognize this isn't for somebody else. This is for me. Sometimes we have the tendency to say, oh, I wish this person would hear this. I wish that person over there would actually take note of what's going on. But this is for us. But when we talk about our society, we have specific areas in life, in our country, that are have to do with life and death. And one of them is capital punishment. And this can be kind of an interesting topic to discuss, because then we start getting into the political realm. But if we assume when there's a capital punishment offense, that the person is guilty, is found guilty, and everything about the charges are true, what do we do with it? Now, we look at the Old Testament. The Old Testament has several instances where it allows for capital punishment. Now, I said allows, and sometimes it seems to command it, but we see instances where it may have been allowed, but it wasn't implemented. Remember when Mary was found to be pregnant? Joseph, being a righteous man, didn't want to shame her or didn't want to disgrace her. He could have had her stoned and killed, but he chose not to. Just because the law says this is what can happen doesn't mean it actually has to happen that way. That's the extreme side of things. But we also recognize that the Old Testament functioned a lot differently than we function today. Because in the Old Testament, there was no separation between church and state. The church was the state, and the state was the church. They were God's people. Israel was God's people. And so he gave them instructions how to live as a religious group and how to govern themselves. We aren't that way. Even though our country may have had Christian principles in which it was founded, and there's a whole debate on those types of things, but what does it look like for us as we are followers of Jesus, living in the kingdom of heaven, while also being subject to secular government? What does that look like for us? Well, we have to make sure we recognize that all people are made in the image of God. No matter who it is. This person may be the scum of the universe. They are made in the present, or in the image of God. And so when we take a human life, we're destroying that which God has made. But we have to be careful to tie ourselves to the government. And because if we look throughout history, we see how dangerous that is. Hitler was able to convince the German church to submit to the Nazis. And we look back on that and say, man, how did that happen? I think sometimes we get so caught up in politics that we forget that we aren't people of the secular world. We are people of the kingdom of heaven. And so we try to live by the rules of the kingdom of heaven as opposed to the rules of the kingdom of the world. But we're living in a fallen, sinful world, and trying to separate those two can be difficult at best. And honestly, this is part of the political debate of Republicans say it's okay to do capital punishments. But then we have other times where Republicans say, no, you can't take that life. And so the Democrats say you can do this or not do that. And so we have this tension that doesn't seem to actually be in line with what Jesus wants us to do. But then we have the concept of what's the difference between, or is there a difference between war and murder? And most people say yes. I haven't read any compelling argument to say there's a difference, or that war and murder are the same thing. But we have to make sure we recognize that murder and killing aren't exactly the same thing. But we come back to what is at the heart of the law. What is the law trying to get to us? And so there are theories as to when is a war just. And some of them can say it has to be initiated by a legitimate government for a worthy cause against others who are soldiers as opposed to civilians when all other means of resolution have failed. But regardless of what situation we encounter, we have to make sure we recognize that everybody we meet, whether we meet them or not, is made in the image of God. So when we talk about taking a life, we have to make sure we come back to what does it mean to be made in the image of God? And what is Jesus calling me to do? Because we can come to the commandment in Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. Pretty simple commandment. 4 words. You must not murder. But again, everyone says, yeah, you shouldn't do that. That's clear, that's obvious. There's no reason that somebody should murder. Like every society, regardless of their religious affiliation or no religious affiliation. Now the intent with the Hebrew here, which is what the Old Testament is written in, was to forbid an unlawful killing of a human being. The Hebrew language has 8 different words for describing the ending of a life. And so killing, murder, those types of things. And the word used here in Exodus chapter 20 is ratzak. That is the Hebrew word, and it's never used in a legal system, military, death sentence, or hunting. It's never used in any of those types of contexts. So it doesn't talk. It's not used in capital punishment talk. It's not used in the military campaigns. It's not used in hunting. It's not used in any of those. It is a premeditated taking of innocent life. It's a deliberate killing of another. Now that would be the letter of the law here. And let's make sure we're moving from the letter of the law to the heart of the law. Because just because somebody deserves it doesn't mean Jesus says we should do it. Because we get caught up in that in a lot of different categories. But murder in this case is always, I guess it's not always intentional. Because there's instances in the Old Testament where we say, well, if somebody did something on accident, what payment or restitution or punishment should be implemented? But murder is often imprecise in our world. We have involuntary manslaughter, first-degree murder, second-degree murder, all of these types of things there's different categories. But remember, the issue is your heart, not their heart. See, what is the value of life? If we are people that are made in the image of God, what does that mean for us? And I would say that we as people are built for eternity, which means that life is sacred. And once it's taken, it cannot be restored. So as we look through the Ten Commandments, we get to this commandment, number 6, and we see that God is the giver of life. One of the concepts we affirm is that God is the giver and sustainer of life. Nothing exists without God making it exist, and nothing continues to exist unless God is sustaining it. Both of those hold true. In the Ten Commandments, particularly number 6, it preserves God's sovereignty over life's beginning and end. Now, this doesn't mean that we are indifferent or ambivalent towards it, that we can speak into this, we can do things to preserve life. But we also recognize that preserving life isn't the highest goal in our world. Jesus has not created you so that you can live as long as physically possible. He created you for a purpose, for a mission. And if the purpose was for you to live as long as possible, we would try to create pods or something around us so that people couldn't harm us, so that we couldn't be subjected to disease or dangerous situations. But living the longest life isn't the only goal that God has for you. He's created us with a desire to live. He's created us with a will to live. But preserving life isn't the highest goal because we are people of life. And when I say we are people of life, it's not just that we have a heartbeat or a pulse. Living the life that God has called us to live isn't about having a body that is still alive. It's about going out there and doing the things that God has called us to do. But if I'm going to talk about something like capital punishment, there's other concepts that we can talk about too. And the other one is probably most prevalent in our minds is that of abortion. Now, one of the things about the abortion debate that drives me crazy is that we tend to debate the wrong things. And we do that because we're trying to prove our point. Because the core debate in abortion is, when does life begin? And if you understand when somebody believes life begins, you may disagree with their premise, and you may disagree with what they believe, but you can understand where they get to. So if someone believes that life begins once the child is out of the womb and is breathing, that's the most extreme side of things. If somebody believes that, then even though you may disagree with that, even though you may think it's terrible, you can see from a logical standpoint how they get to the conclusion that abortion is okay anytime. I don't agree with that, but I can see how they get there. See, the church's standpoint is that life begins at conception. And so because that life is something that needs to be preserved, but the debate is not on somebody's rights versus others, it's of when does life begin. And if we understand when life begins, then we can say, then we need to protect this. This is how we preserve life. And so, but we debate on, well, the hardships this caused somebody else. And one of the things the church needs to recognize is, first and foremost, you have specific passions and desires. It's okay for you to have specific passions and desires. It's okay for you not to be all things to all people. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there are ramifications to the intensity of this stance of, and how do we make sure that we value life regardless of whose life it is? So in this case, how do we value the mother and the unborn child? How do we value those things? And that's tricky. And we can't answer all questions in every situation. But the reality is, if conception is not the place that we mark it, then there are dangerous places that we can conclude. So a popular place is that, people say that, sentience or something like that, if they need to be able to have conscious thoughts and feelings. The problem is we have other health conditions as we age where we may not have those types of things. And then can we apply the same principle to those situations as an unborn child? And the reality is there's no easy answer with this. There's no quick fix. But we recognize that life is valuable. Above all else, we have to make sure we believe and recognize and implement that life is valuable. And Jesus knows that. That's why in Matthew chapter 5, 21 and 22, he's in the Sermon on the Mount. And he said, you've heard it was said, you must not murder. Anyone who commits murder is subject to judgment. But I say to you, even if you are angry with someone, you are subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you are in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you are in danger of the fires of hell. Now again, all societies implement Command 6 of the Ten Commandments of you must not murder. But Jesus says it's more than the physical act. He gets to the heart of the issue. There's a heart matter. Murder is about your heart, not their heart. It's about what Jesus wants to do inside of you. So what Jesus does is he takes the commandment, and it's no longer an outward thing, it's an inward. He moves it from this exterior list of rules written on stone to what's your heart? How do you care for people? How do you care about people? How do you validate them? Jesus moves to the heart over the letter. So wishing someone harm breaks commandment 6. Remember, the New Testament has this Greek word for love called agape, unconquerable benevolence. It means we want the best for the other person, regardless of our relationship with them. We can't show agape if we want somebody harmed. So this spirit of murder needs to be rooted out of our lives, and it can only be rooted out in our lives through the work of the Holy Spirit in you. It's not something that you can just do better at. It's Jesus has got to do a transforming work in you. In order to show love to people who bother you, Jesus has to work in your life. Only through Jesus is that possible. So by cursing someone or calling them an idiot is what my version said. Some of yours would say fool. Treating them unkindly breaks the heart of this law, and Jesus says you're in danger of the fires of hell. That's pretty intense. We can almost say that kind of escalated quickly, didn't it? Commandment 6, 4 words, you must not murder. But Jesus says if you're mean to people, your heart's in danger. That's hard. Because we got people that really frustrate us. We got people that really, really bother us. But the law, as Jesus summed it up, is basically 2 components. Love God with everything you have and love your neighbor as yourself. The first 4 commandments are our relationship with God. The other 6 commandments are interpersonal relationships. How do we interact with others? So this is so crucial of how do we love others? How do we show them love? This commandment means that we show love to our neighbor. Now, later on in Matthew 5, we're not going to get there, but in Matthew 5:44, Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Following Jesus is hard. And we're not going to find answers on how we can follow Jesus out there. The world's not going to give us answers to this. Our political parties aren't going to give us the answers to this. Murder is about your heart. It's not about their heart. It's about what Jesus wants to do in your life. But I came across this statistic that really bothered me, though. And it's by the American Psychological Association. By the time a child has completed elementary school, this child will have witnessed 8,000 deaths on screen, with over 100,000 acts of physical violence. That's the world we live in. And there are a lot of people who are waiting for the next episode of Law and Order or CSI or whatever crime show it is. And this is just prevalent in our lives. Now, if we backtrack about 200 years and earlier, we can see how science and medicine and technology have made crazy leaps and bounds. And life is able to be preserved and enhanced in awesome ways that are unimaginable a few hundred years ago and further. And I say that because people growing up 200 years ago or so would experience death more commonly than we would, and in some of those really tragic instances of someone dying young, infant mortality, death from childbirth, or diseases that would spring up when we'd have plagues. But there's a big difference between living through the reality of death of somebody you know and love and just watching it on screen, because you get desensitized to it when you watch it on screen. And so I point this out to say that our society doesn't value life in the way that Jesus calls us to value life. We're made in the image of God. And so we see something on television and we say, oh, it's just entertainment. And it may be, and there's nothing wrong. I'm not saying you should stop watching crime shows. But we need to make sure we recognize how we can easily be desensitized to this stuff and not follow Jesus and how he calls us to live. But there are two other issues in our world that are at least worthwhile talking about when it comes to the value of life, and that is suicide and euthanasia. I've never encountered a situation where someone died by suicide where it wasn't tragic. Every time someone has died by suicide, it wrecks people up like crazy. It does. And some of there's things we hear as to why would somebody do this, and they can feel things like worthless or hopeless, or feel like they had no value or nothing to give. Now, from an outside perspective, everybody can see, those are lies. There are some people that really struggle with this type of stuff. And if you know somebody, if you have a close friend, family, relative, whatever, that struggles with these types of things, it can be exhausting for you to reassure them. But imagine how exhausting it is for them to live through it every second of every day. See, we don't condemn people for having these thoughts and feelings. What Jesus calls us to do is show them that they have value. If somebody struggles with these thoughts of suicide, our job as followers of Jesus is to say, Jesus has more for you. Jesus created you specifically. He created you with a purpose. You have value. That's what Jesus calls us to do. Now, it can be exhausting, but again, remember how much more exhausting it is for the person who struggles with those thoughts than it is for the person who's trying to speak against those untrue thoughts. So Jesus calls us to value life. We must speak against these lies. So then we have euthanasia, or doctor-assisted suicide. And this can be really difficult because, as I said, preserving life isn't the ultimate goal. But there's a difference between preserving life and taking life into your own hands. Because part of the principle here with the commandment is that it maintains God's sovereignty over the beginning and end of life. God is the one in control. And as difficult as it is, end of life can be a beautiful, grace-filled time. I remember the first time I was in a room when someone passed away. This person loved Jesus with everything. She was 86, had leukemia, and essentially got to the point where treatment wasn't working, so she stopped treatment. But I was in the room with the family, and all the kids loved Jesus. And I remember walking out of that room after she passed. There was a huge weight of what I just was a part of. But I was also overwhelmed with the presence of God. Now, if you don't know Jesus, that situation is a lot different. Which is one of our callings, is be witnesses in this world. And some of you may have experiences where you've lost a loved one and you know how difficult that is to be present during those moments of struggle, and how, particularly when disease takes over, it can change somebody so much. And I'm not trying to say anything about this that's easy, but we recognize God is sovereign over the beginning and the end of life. So I don't always know the balance between when can machines keep someone alive in hopes of restoration and when we allow the disease to take over. Those are not easy questions that we can just answer with blanket statements. But they are questions that we can answer with prayerful consideration and asking Jesus to give us guidance and wisdom, but also strength. When we talk about things like death, this is really heavy. But we can read the Ten Commandments and say, you must not murder. Check, move on. Or we can look under the deeper ramifications of what Jesus is calling us to do and recognize there's a big cost here. There's difficulties. There's burden. There's expectations. But above all else, Jesus calls us to value life. What does it look like for you to value life in others? And I think part of what Jesus is calling us in Matthew 5, he calls us to radically love those who the world says it's okay to hate. Because there are people the world says it's okay to not like them. It's okay to ignore them. It's okay to disrespect them. It's okay to speak poorly of them. It's okay to not associate with them. But Jesus says we need to love everybody. Because if not, we've got a heart issue. We've got issues that danger our life with Jesus. Jesus can transform your attitudes. He can transform your life. He is the giver and the sustainer of life. He is sovereign of both the beginning and the end. So I think when we recognize that we are called to give our lives to Jesus and see our value and worth through Jesus and help others see their value and worth through Jesus as well, that can change our interactions. It will change how we judge people. And I say judge and not necessarily negative connotations, but sometimes judgment is. But it changes how we see people. What would it look like for you to see people through the eyes of Jesus? That's how we can value life.